Well, thank you, George, and thank you, Julie, and thank you all for coming to Colorado. You know, Colorado is an amazing state, a wonderful state. I hope that we don't have an amazing baseball team, but we do have an amazing stadium. I would encourage you, so let me just follow up on what George was saying. You're right. You do get to see two of the worst teams in the National League, but you get to see it from one of the best stadiums in the National League. I promise you a wonderful evening and great views. I would also urge all of you, a lot of you, at least I know when I travel out of state, whenever I say I'm from Colorado, people always ask me about one thing. Yeah, you know what it is. So I would say, remember, it is still unlawful to smoke in public. And if you choose to buy edibles, this is something we hadn't anticipated, take it slow. We know that we've had situations where people buy that candy bar or those jelly beans that are infused with THC, and they take a bite or two and think nothing's happening. I better take some more. And they keep eating till it's all gone, and an hour later, strange things happen. So, at least that is what I have heard. So, use good judgment. I know that some of you are of my generation. I will tell you that, again, what I have heard is that the marijuana back then, it was very different than marijuana now. Now it is much more potent. So again, let's preserve the image of higher education leaders by not doing anything publicly irresponsible. Now, enjoy the baseball game. Colorado is a great place because, again, you'll see on any one day in Colorado, you can experience 3, maybe even 4 seasons. Things change very dramatically here. It's part of what makes it wonderful. It's part of why so many of us choose to live here in Colorado. But Colorado isn't perfect. And so what Julie had asked me to do was to talk about some of those policy failures, things that we tried that didn't work. And I wanted to do that, but it's also an election year. And some of my staff said, let's not emphasize the failures quite so much. Or at least if you talk about them, make sure you tie them to the previous administration. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, I really want to talk about one thing in particular, and that is, and Julie kind of led into it, was remediation. A couple of other things about Colorado, though. I'm sorry. Julie, I think, mentioned, or maybe it was George, the 16th Street Mall, which, again, is just a block over. It's wonderful. It's a mile long. It goes down to our newly renovated Union Station. There's some remarkable stuff there. But the 16th Street Mall is sort of a pedestrian mall. But remember, it is a pedestrian mall that has very large buses that go barreling down it. And what happens every summer is people who aren't from Denver go walking up and down the mall, and they're looking around, and they step down into what looks like more sidewalk, but is really the bus lane, and they don't hear those big buses coming. So just urge you, go to the 16th Street Mall. Don't only look up, look around. Those buses, no matter what you may have imbibed earlier, you will feel it if you get hit by one. So now, let's talk about policy failures. Let's talk about how we re-examine what we're doing. I think one of the things that I was privileged to have the opportunity to do tonight was sitting next to Dr. Joni Finney, who's going to be talking tomorrow about the relationship between state policy and state performance. And I would really encourage all of you to go and to listen and think about that, because so much of what we do now is really focused on policy, but we don't always take the time to sit back and tie that to, well, how are we performing? What is working? Do we measure it? Do we know that it is the best policy, it is the right policy for students and not for institutions or not for a state budget problem? We need to be thinking about how we determine that. And so what do we look at? What's the framework we use? So here in Colorado, and I'm sure it's true in all of your states, you've made mistakes with the best intentions, but mistakes nonetheless. And in higher ed, we often do things, continue to do things, just because that's the way we've always done them. Now, I will tell you, when I first came into higher education, I didn't have a lot of higher education experience. I had been a student. My only previous higher ed job had been as a custodian at CU Boulder, and that was the only previous higher ed experience I could point to when I applied to be a president of Pikes Peak Community College. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I kind of have been, I guess one of the things I want to kind of close with, but let me jump right to it now, is that as we try to innovate, as we think about how to do things better, we would say the price of innovation is really a tolerance for failure. We've got to be willing to try new things, and sometimes they'll work and sometimes they won't, but we've got to recognize when they don't, we've got to be able to then go back and say we're going to do things differently. So I like to think my whole career has been about a tolerance for failure. Because I'm a lieutenant governor who was never a politician and never ran for any office before this one. I was a college and university president, but I was never an academic. I was only a mediocre student, to be honest. But I managed to be an okay college president and university president because I was willing to ask questions. But I also found that in higher education, or frankly, even in state government, when you ask questions, people get very nervous. They don't want to have to defend what they do. It's the way they've always done it. It's the way it was done to them. But higher education has to change. Higher education has to change because the people we're serving are changing. You know, let me give you an example. Here in Colorado, we are a very well-educated state by just about any measure. If you look at our adult population over the age of 25, we're the second most well-educated state in the country. But if you begin to break that down by demographic groups, you see that we have the biggest gap, or the second biggest gap, between our white majority population and our next largest minority group, our Hispanic population. So over 50% of our white adults over 25 in our Front Range communities have a post-secondary credential, but only about 17 or 18% of our Hispanics over the age of 25 have a credential. And then we need to look at our school system. Right now, our state is about 1/5 Hispanic, but 1/3 of our K-12 system is Hispanic. So if we really care about the future of our state, we've got to say, what are we going to do to serve that population that heretofore, that's kind of an academic-sounding word, never mind. Before this, we didn't serve very effectively. So what are we going to do differently? We can't do things the same way. And so think about higher education. When I talk to faculty and say, you know, it's remarkable how many students you're failing, they would say, well, that's my job. You know, we have a higher education system that always has been sort of a select and sort process. That was what our job was. We allowed in only the best students, and we allowed out really only the very best performers of those best. But at the same time, we are saying as state policymakers, we need more and more of our young people to go to college and to get a degree. Because, and I'll use Colorado again as an example, we have, again, as I said, about 50% of our white Front Range adults with a college degree, which sounds pretty good. But when we look at workforce projections by 2020, we know that about 70% of all jobs will require some post-secondary credential. So we're not even close to where we need to be. We've got to do things differently. So we tell young people that. We tell them, you need to go to college if you want to have a job, if you want to compete for a job, and we need you to go to college because it's not just good for you, it's good for our state. It's mandatory, it's necessary for our state that we educate all of those young people. But if we admit them to school when in the past we wouldn't have admitted some of these same kids, or we encourage kids who might previously not have gone to go, we lose too many of them. So in Colorado, we're very mediocre, candidly, about 27th when you look at our throughput. That is, when you look at our retention and completion rate. So this isn't new to any of you, we've all begun to move from a focus on enrollment to a focus on completion. But that means we got to do things differently. Now, when I arrived at a community college, I was president of Pikes Peak Community College. It's the second largest community college in the state. It's a multi-campus college, a lot of students, a lot of former military students, a lot of traditional students, a lot of minority and first-generation students. And I said, you know, and Julie mentioned this, a high percentage of them needed remediation. We do these remediation reports, as Julie said, every year because the legislature requires us to. And every time we do one, we look at it and go, man, this is really terrible. And then we blame the K-12 system, so we blame the schools, we blame the teachers, we blame the students themselves, and say, no wonder they're not successful. It's not our fault. It's somebody else's. So when I arrived at Pikes Peak, I said, so if I'm a brand new student just showing up here on campus, where's my first stop after I go to the admissions office? And they say, you go to the testing center, and you take the Accuplacer exam. And I said, okay, let's do that. I'll go down, I'll take the Accuplacer exam. Now again, high tolerance for failure. Because I knew that if I did not perform well on the Accuplacer, it wouldn't just be between me and the testing center. I knew that information would get out there pretty quickly. But I thought it was important to do that. So I went down to the testing center and said, okay, I'm here to take my Accuplacer exam to find out whether I need remedial math or English. What should I do to prepare for this exam? And the testing center director said, oh, don't prepare. Well, we want to take you cold. We want to make sure that we don't place you someplace where you can't be successful. We want to take you where you are. We want to place you in the lowest possible course because we think you have the greatest chance of success. At the time, I thought, well, I guess that makes sense. I don't know. But think about that. We know now that remediation that way doesn't work, that we put people into these remedial courses, and we think of success as passing that remedial course. But is that the right way to measure success? Well, we know now that's a crazy way to measure success of a remedial program. Really, success is, should it be completing a remedial sequence? Or should it be completing and passing that first college-level gateway course? Or really, should it be, did you earn the credential that you wanted? I think that's how we need to be measuring success. So here in Colorado, we weren't doing that. So we needed to step back and reassess. But it was hard to get people to reassess because, frankly, at the community college, the way we were funded, that was a critical revenue source for us. About 40% of the revenue at many of our community colleges came from remedial courses, students in remedial courses. Why would we want to give that up? Why would we want fewer kids taking fewer hours in remedial coursework if most of the funding we received came directly from student tuition? It wouldn't make sense. So we had to, again, get people to think about who are we trying to serve? Are we trying to serve the institution or are we trying to serve the student? And then how do we change these really perverse financial incentives that say the longer we keep a student in remedial or elsewhere, the better off we are? We need to change to a system, as we're doing here now in Colorado, to a financial system that begins to reward performance. But at the same time, we've got another policy in place that runs counter to that, and that policy is we frankly don't like to pay for higher education. So we tell institutions we're going to allocate state funding based on how you perform in terms of completion, but we're really only providing 20 or 30% of your revenue. Most of your revenue still comes from tuition, so it might still be in your interest to be focused on how many students we can get to take how many hours, regardless of how successful they are. We need to, again, think about what we're going to do. We need to reassess. And we need to communicate what's our goal here. I think that is one of the key things that we don't often do in higher education. What is our broad statewide goal? Is it to enroll students? Is it to graduate students? Is it to control costs? Is it to reinforce social and class distinctions? You'll hear a little bit more about that tomorrow as well from one of our speakers. In the speech on degrees of inequality, you'll hear that a little bit challenging, I think, whether all degrees are created equal, whether they all have value, whether we ought to be willing to pay for them all the same. And Dr. Suzanne Metier is here to talk to you tomorrow morning about that. But we need to be critically evaluating what we're doing, and we all need to be on the same page, and we need to be communicating that. That's what we've tried to do in Colorado. We've created a statewide master plan. We've involved all the institutions in doing it, and we've tried to keep it simple. We said our main goal is to produce more high-quality credentials. Just graduate more students of all ages, and then close degree attainment gaps. Because frankly, we're not going to do the first if we can't do the second. We can't produce more degrees if we're focused on a declining portion of the population. We've got to do a better job with our African American, Hispanic, and first-generation students, or our higher education system, and in fact, our state and our country cannot be successful. And we need to get everybody to understand that's important. And it's not something that's only a burden that should be borne by the community colleges or the access institutions. Our flagship universities, our selective universities, all have a role to play, and we need to evaluate all of them based on their performance with respect to that critical metric. And then again, we need to be measuring that. We need to be measuring it, reporting on it, and rewarding it. And if we don't do that, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to get change because we're not forcing it. And we're dealing in an environment, higher education, where change, you all know this, where change is very tough. We all know how we were educated. We all know the way we were taught, the way if your faculty members, the way you teach now is the way largely you were taught. And you think it worked for me, it should work for these new students. We've got to recognize we're educating a whole different group with whole different needs, and it's not just about making sure that higher education is accessible, that is in terms of affordable, but that it's accessible in terms of you can be successful, you can earn a credential. Those are the things that we need to focus on. Now again, I think we've done that here in Colorado by saying we're going to redo remediation. We convinced the community colleges that it is in their interests, and it's in the students' interest to change the way they provide remediation so that we get students through more quickly. We've also said to the four-year schools that if you admit a student and that student needs remedial coursework, you ought to be able to provide it at the four-year school. You don't need to send that student away to a two-year school, and the state ought to provide funding support for you to do it. So we have created a law that allows us to provide something called supplemental academic instruction, so that a student who needs remediation can enroll in a credit-bearing course and get supplemental instruction on the side so that that student doesn't lose time, lose ground, and lose money. And worse, lose hope. We have too many students who show up, test in, take the test, and find out you need 2 semesters, 3 semesters, 4 semesters of remedial coursework. And what do most of those students do? They say, screw it. Man, I wanted to get a credential, but I don't have 4 or 6 years to get a 2-year degree, and we lose them. We can't afford to lose them. We need to figure out how to help make them successful, and that does require a reassessment. That does require us to recognize that the way we've offered remediation in the past hasn't worked. It's generated revenue, and if that's how we measure whether it's worked, I guess it worked. You know, we've enrolled a lot of students. I guess if that's how we measure whether it's worked, well, I guess it works. But if we are measuring it by how many of those students actually moved through and complete a degree, we know that the system we've had in place hasn't worked. We need to face up to it and need to say we're going to do it differently. And we need to do that not just with respect to remediation, but the way we fund higher education. We need to do it in the way we evaluate the quality of the credentials that we produce. We need to do it in the way of looking at which institutions get to educate which students and how much we charge them. We need to be doing it in the way we evaluate our faculty, and not just our faculty, but our administrators. Everything we do needs to be constantly measured and reassessed, and we have to have the courage to say, that's not working. We can do better. And only when we do that are we going to make the difference for those students, and not just those students, but for our institutions and our states. The difference that we need to make if we want to be successful and call ourselves educators. So thank you. I would encourage you to, again, reassess. Think about what you're doing. Think about whether it's working. Think about whether there might be a better way to do it. Learn from your colleagues. Evaluate what you're doing in your own state. And if it's not working, absolutely the very best, start all over. Innovation requires a tolerance for failure. Don't be afraid to fail, but be afraid to keep doing bad things over and over. Thank you very much.